Today we are continuing to read The Hardy Boys, Hunting for Hidden Gold by Franklin W. Dixon. When we last left the Hardys, they had just tumbled down the rock face towards the river. Chapter 11, Shadow of the Bear. The icy shock of the water stung the Hardys back to full consciousness. They flailed their arms and legs wildly, fighting to get to the surface. Frank broke the water first, gasping for breath. His heart skipped when he saw nothing but the half-frozen river, the struggling horses, and the steep-sided canyon. Where was Joe? Then his brother bobbed to the surface nearby. Thank goodness, Frank murmured. Neither boy had breath to spare to make himself heard above the roar of the rushing current. The ice extended outward from both banks, but near the center the water was surging along in full torrent. With every passing moment, Frank and Joe were being swept further downstream. Joe pointed to the horses. The two saddled animals were breaking their way through the ice, gradually swimming and floundering toward shore. Daisy, the elderly pack mare loaded down with supplies, was having a more difficult time. She may drown, Frank thought fearfully. He and Joe summoned all their strength and swam towards the frantic animals. In a few minutes, their own horses managed to reach the bank. Daisy was rolling her eyes, whinnying and snorting with terror. Frank and Joe were finally able to steer her to safety through the broken ice. At last the boys staggered out of the water and flopped down on a rocky, snow-covered bank. The saddle horses stood shaking themselves further up the shore, and Daisy trotted on to join them. Wow, Joe took a deep breath. What a day for a swim! Joe, we're pretty lucky at that, Frank got up. We better see about the supplies, and a fire if we can make one, Joe added. Both boys were shivering and blue with cold. They hurried towards their horses. At least half the provisions and gear strapped to Daisy's back had come loose and had been carried away. Let's get out of sight first, Joe suggested. Someone may be spying on us up on the mountain. Right, Frank agreed. I'm sure now that that barrier on the trail was no accident. The brothers led the horses towards some sheltering timber. Just beyond the trees, they discovered a rocky recess in the mountainside. Here, they grouped the horses and proceeded to survey the state of their supplies. Well, Joe said, at least it's not so bad as it might have been. Most of their provisions were gone, as well as their tent and other camp equipment. But they had blankets, towels, spare clothing, fishing gear, a compass, matches, and some food. Luckily, everything had been packed in waterproof wrapping. I'm sure glad we still have that compass, Frank remarked, as the boys unsaddled the horses and used the towels to rub down the animals. You bet, Joe agreed. If we should lose our bearings in this wilderness with our food so low, we'd really be in a jam. You build a fire, Joe, Frank suggested, while I get dry clothes out for both of us. After donning fresh clothing in the warmth of the crackling flames and drying their windbreakers, the Hardys soon felt more comfortable. Their horses rapidly recovered and began nibbling the shrubs and winter-dry brush sticking up through the snow. Frank stepped out of their rocky niche and shaded his eyes towards the sun, which was already red and low in the sky. In another half an hour, it would be out of sight behind the mountains. Too late to do much traveling now, said Frank. We may as well make camp here and strike out for Windy Peak early in the morning. Okay, Frank, I'll try some fishing. That looks like a trout stream. He put their collapsible fishing rod together and went out, heading towards the river amongst the trees. Watch your step on that ice, Frank called. As Joe disappeared from view, his brother took out their precious compass. Using the setting sun as a reference, he checked the action of the needle to see if any magnetic ore in the range might be affecting it. The deviation, if any, seemed to be very slight. It's a cinch we'll never get back up that cliff to the trail, at least not here. We'll have to follow the river and try to get some place where the canyon walls are not so steep, he thought. Frank! Frank! It was Joe calling from the river. Help, Frank, help! The ice, Frank thought. Joe's broken through. Laying the compass on a flat rock, the older Hardy dashed towards the river. To Frank's amazement, Joe was in no danger. But he was sprawled flat on the ice, clinging desperately to the rod and trying not to lose the prized catch he had hooked. The fish had sounded and was bending the rod almost a U-shape as it fought to escape. Quick, give me a hand, Joe shouted. Frank flat-footed gingerly out onto the ice, grabbed the line, and began hauling it in. "I guess we're breaking all the rules for game fishing," he called back with a chuckle, "but this one is a fellow we can't risk losing." The fish put up a furious struggle that roused the boys' admiration, but they finally managed to reel in a huge cutthroat trout. "Oh boy, what a swell catch!" Frank cried. "There's our supper." "First fish that's ever decked me," Joe said, grinning, "but then it's the first time I ever tried to trout fish on ice." Back at camp, Joe set about cleaning the fish while Frank built up the fire. Suddenly, Joe heard his brothers gasp. "What's wrong?" "The compass. I left it right here on this flat rock. Now it's gone." "Are you sure?" "Positive. I put it exactly where the pine cone was. Wait a minute. That wasn't here before." Frank broke off and picked up the pine cone, and with an exasperated face, he said, "You know what, Joe? A pack rat has been here." "I bet you're right. The rat picked up the compass because it's bright and shiny and left a pine cone in its place." The Hardys looked at each other gravely. Any other time, the situation might have been funny, but right now the compass was vital to them. Without it, they might never find their way safely out of the wilderness. "Come on, let's look for it," Frank urged. "I remember reading that pack rats will often drop their prize if something else catches their eye." The boys began a systematic search, pacing back and forth around the camp in widening circles. At last, Frank detected some faint rodent tracks in the trampled snow and soon spotted a shiny object on the cliffside brush. Frank pounced on the compass with a cry of relief. "Whew!" he exclaimed. "What a break!" "And better keep it in your pocket from now on," Joe advised. The trout, cooked over heated rocks, made a tasty dish. After the meal, the boys felt more cheerful. As they huddled around the campfire in their blankets, Frank said thoughtfully, "Tomorrow's the day for Big Al's meeting." "Right. I wish we could find the place." "If only we knew what Shadow of the Bear meant," Frank mused. In spite of the cold and their desperate situation, the boys slept well. Their horses, too, evidently slept well during the night, staying close together near the embers of the fire. The next morning, Frank and Joe made a cold breakfast of oatmeal mush and dried apricots from their scanty supplies. They then fed and saddled the horses, strapping their remaining gear on Daisy's back, and headed downriver. The canyon turned and twisted along the curve of the mountainside, and the footing was treacherous. As they rode, the Hardys continually scanned the sides of the gorge, hoping to find a route out of the canyon. Twice they dismounted and tried to thread their way upward, leading the horses, but both times the cliff walls proved too steep. At last, however, the canyon opened out and the slope of the cliffs became more gentle. Relieved, Frank and Joe halted for another cold meal. Then they rode to higher ground and struck back across the rolling foothills of the mountain range in the general direction of town. Eventually, they got into a broken trail. About midday, the brothers swung over a rise on the rocky, snow-covered path, and Frank reined in sharply. "Look!" he exclaimed, and indicated the area to their right. Looming against the sky was a huge, ungainly rock formation that crudely resembled a bear standing upright. "Al's meeting place," Joe breathed. Dismounting, the boys ground hitched their horses out of sight behind a clump of boulders. They then crept cautiously forward towards the huge rock formation. To their surprise, Frank and Joe discovered that it was poised on the rim of a small box canyon. The Hardys cautiously peered over the edge. The canyon was choked with drifted snow, from which protruded a few scrubby trees and bush. The view directly below was blocked by a shelving overhang of rock about 20 feet further down and extended along the cliff wall. The boys could detect no sign or sound of human beings. "Maybe we missed the meeting," Joe murmured, "or this isn't the place after all." "I bet it is," Frank replied. "My guess is the confab hasn't been held yet." He gazed across the canyon. "Let's keep an eye on that bear shadow." In the lowering sun, the rock formation cast a formless shadow on the opposite wall. As the boys stood up, Joe remarked with a puzzled look, That shadow doesn't look much like a bear." "True, but it might at some other time of day. Remember, Slim didn't name any hour for the meeting. He just said, 'Shadow of the Bear.'" "I get it," Joe broke in excitedly. "Maybe the meeting is to take place when the bear shows up clearly on the canyon wall." And that ought to be when the sun drops a little lower, Frank added. Do you think the meeting will be down inside the canyon? Probably. Up here, this rock formation, the gang would be too easy to spot. But this looks like a blind canyon to me, Joe objected. How could they get into it? There may be an entrance we can't see from here. Let's stay out of sight. The boys found cover in a nearby cluster of rocks and brush. As the sun sank lower, the bare shadow across the canyon became more distinct and realistic. Listen, Joe whispered suddenly. From somewhere below came a clopping of horses' hooves. Then a sound of men reining up and dismounting. The Hardys peered downward, but the rocky overhang of the canyon prevented from seeing what was taking place. A murmur of voices came drifting up. The boys strained their ears and recognized Slim's voice, but could not make out what he was saying. Then a harsh voice, unfamiliar to the Hardys, spoke out clearly. "You sure muffed things and lucky loads, Slipgun." "Couldn't we help, Al?" returned a voice too muffled to identify. "One more job like that and I'll..." The harsh tone faded into a threatening mutter. Frank and Joe could hardly keep from shouting for joy. They had found Big Al. If only they could dare to try capturing him.